live in a time where suffering has become unmentionable. Not because it no longer exists, but because it no longer fits the script. You're expected to be well-adjusted, to function, to smile on camera, to wake up, post something wise, drink something green, and pretend none of this feels hollow. And if it does, you label it burnout. You medicate. You distract. You don't ask what your suffering is trying to reveal. You try to delete it. But what if your pain isn't the problem? What if it's the most honest part of you? Fyodor Dostoevsky believed that suffering is not a flaw of existence but the doorway into it. He wasn't a philosopher in the academic sense. He was a convict, a man buried alive in the Siberian snow, a man who had stood before a firing squad and lived to write about the soul. His novels Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, Notes from Underground are spiritual autopsies. They dissect guilt, resentment, despair, and redemption with surgical precision. Why should you care? Because Dostoevsky saw something in human suffering that modern psychology often misses. Suffering is not just something you survive. It is something you must interpret. And without that interpretation, your pain becomes pathology, shameful, isolating, and endless. There are many kinds of suffering, but Dostoevsky saw four in particular that modern life only intensifies. The suffering of Shima, private crucifixion masked by competence. The suffering of avoidance, a life lived behind glass, watching but not touching. The suffering of moral conflict, the war between your desire to be good and your need to protect your pride. And finally, the suffering that transforms the pain that cracks your full self wide open. These are not diagnostic labels. They are existential realities. They are what you feel when you tell the truth about your aloneness. When you collapse at 3 a.m., not from physical exhaustion, but from the unbearable weight of wearing a life that does not fit. But first, a necessary hesitation. Many avoid Dostoevsky because his stories are dark, his characters unstable, his themes intense. Why read someone who makes you feel worse? Because he doesn't leave you there. Because, like a spiritual surgeon, Dostoevsky cuts but only to heal. As he wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, "What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love." This is not poetic despair. It's psychological truth. What if your deepest suffering isn't about failure or rejection, but your inability to feel connected, to feel clean, to feel whole? We are trained to label that kind of pain as dysfunction, to self-diagnose and suppress. But Dostoevsky didn't want you to suppress it. He wanted you to look deeper, because buried inside that pain is your entire being, waiting to be reclaimed. This is the quiet agony of the modern soul. You walk into rooms and feel like an imposter. You accomplish goals and feel nothing. You go numb in the moments you're supposed to be happy. You chase dopamine and call it ambition. You curate a self online and wonder why you feel empty offline. None of this makes you broken. It makes you awake and in the wrong world. That awakening looks like dysfunction. Dostoevsky didn't just tell stories. He held a mirror to what most people spend their lives denying. When Ivan Karamazov cries, "I respectfully return my ticket," he's refusing to accept a world in which innocent children suffer. That is not melodrama, his moral protest. And when the underground man mocks society's obsession with reason and self-interest, he's not trying to be clever. He's screaming from the basement of human consciousness, telling you that logic won't save your soul. I say, let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground. This isn't cynicism. It's the sadness of a man who sees the contradiction between what we claim to value and how we actually live. And if you've ever kept silent in a room full of people who don't know you, felt disgusted with your own indifference, or stared at your own reflection and not recognized the person you've become, then you are not far from the people in Nar. Dostoevsky's pages. In the age of content, pleasure, and image, Dostoevsky reminds you of the weight of the soul. That the soul aches, collapses, breaks open and sometimes, only sometimes, begins to shine. So this is not a guide to escaping suffering. It's a meditation on how to suffer consciously, how to stop numbing the ache and start listening to it, how to turn your pain into a doorway instead of a prison. And the first step is to name what kind of suffering you're actually in. The worst kind of suffering is not the one that breaks you. It's the one that wears you down, slowly so. Slowly you forget there was ever another way to live. And Dostoevsky's question to you is simple. Will you let it numb you, or will you let it wake you? Section the second. The suffering of shame and moral collapse. Shame is not embarrassment. It is not guilt. It is not the feeling you get when you forget someone's name or send a text you regret. Shame, as Dostoevsky knew it, is deeper. Shame is existential, collapse, the psychic nausea that comes from being at odds with your own conscience. It is the experience of seeing yourself clearly all at once and recoiling. It is not, I did something wrong. It is, I am something wrong. And it haunts you, silently. In moments when you're alone, when your masks fall, when the room is dark and the scroll is done, when nothing is left but that question, what have I become? Dostoevsky knew this suffering intimately. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov commits a murder, not out of desperation, but out of ideology. He tells himself he is above morality, a man of reason, of vision, of will. But after the act, he unravels. Not because he was caught, but because his own soul betrays him. It wasn't a human being I killed, it was a principle. Fyodor Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. That line is a lie, Raskolnikov tells himself. Because deep down, he knows you can't outthink your soul. You can rationalize, you can explain, you can justify, but your body remembers. Your subconscious remembers. Your shame remembers. This kind of suffering is everywhere today. You tell yourself the affair didn't matter because it was just physical. You say it's okay to ghost someone because closure is overrated. You use people's admiration as anesthesia. You pretend your success means you're a good person, but something in you aches, because you know when your actions contradict your values. Even if no one else sees it, you do. And the more you ignore it, the more you divide against yourself. This is what Dostoevsky called the split soul, a being at war with itself. One part noble, the other cynical. One reaching for transcendence, the other drowning in self-loathing. In Notes from Underground, the narrator isn't just bitter, he's rotting. He despises others, but it's a projection of his own self-hatred. He's too proud to be vulnerable, and too self-aware to be happy. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. Notes from Underground, he admits this not to shock you, but to drag you into the same basement. He wants you to see, but spiritual sickness begins when you betray your own capacity for love, vulnerability, and truth. And here's the modern version of this collapse. You smile when you're seething. You applaud someone who wounded you. You give your body to someone you don't trust. You tell everyone you're fine because you've built a life that doesn't allow for weakness. But the shame doesn't leave. It just goes underground like Dostoevsky's narrator festering, poisoning everything. You don't need to commit a crime to feel this level of shame. You just need to live in contradiction long enough. You just need to wear the mask long enough that even you forget what's beneath it. Nothing is easier than to denounce the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than to understand him. Dostoevsky, this is one of his most compassionate insights. Shame doesn't come from being bad. It comes from knowing you could be better. It comes from seeing the gap between who you are and who you were meant to be and being too afraid to cross it. This fear leads to what Dostoevsky warned against most, moral paralysis. You stop believing you can change. You become stuck in self-hatred, but still addicted to being seen as virtuous. You post about justice while treating the people closest to you with passive cruelty. You call yourself tired when you're actually guilty. You perform virtue while drowning in unresolved shame. So what's the way out? Dostoevsky never promised an easy answer, but he gave us a clue. In Crime and Punishment, it isn't punishment that redeems Raskolnikov. It's confession. It's vulnerability. It's the slow, raw work of allowing himself to feel again through suffering, through love, through truth. The journey is not linear. It is not clean. But it begins the moment he stops trying to outsmart his shame and begins to listen to it. This is Dostoevsky's radical insight. Shame is not something to hide. It is something to interpret. It's not a weakness. It's your soul telling you this isn't who you are. So don't suppress it. Don't medicate it away. Don't drown it in status or screens or sarcasm. Sit with it. Let it teach you. And when you're ready, let it transform you. Because here's the truth. The soul doesn't need you to be perfect. It needs you to be honest. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is say, I'd been living a lie, and I want to stop. That's where healing begins, not with more accomplishments, not with more applause, but with a reckoning. And Dostoevsky's message is this: don't run from your shame. Walk through it, because on the other side is a self that no longer has anything to hide. Here is section the third of the essay, The 4 Types of Suffering According to Dostoevsky. Section the third, The Suffering of Nihilism and Avoidance. There is a suffering darker than pain. It's the absence of pain. The total, sterile numbness that creeps in when nothing matters anymore. When truth feels naive. When goodness feels weak. When love feels laughable. This is the suffering of nihilism, when the soul no longer revolts, but shrugs. Dostoevsky didn't just describe this state, he predicted it. He saw, long before postmodernism and mass consumer culture, what happens when a society kills God, but keeps the rituals. He saw what happens when meaning dies out, but we keep pretending we're fine. Man only likes to count his troubles, he doesn't calculate his happiness. Fyodor Dostoevsky notes from underground, this is not pessimism. It's diagnosis. Because the man in the underground is not irrational, he's hyper-rational. He's not chaotic, he's over-civilized. He's the modern soul, stripped of all illusion. And now, all he can do is mock the idea that anything is worth feeling. Sound familiar? You open your phone. Another tragedy. Another scandal. Another post about self-care next to an ad for anxiety pills. You roll your eyes. You scroll past it. You see someone fall in love and secretly feel disgust. You see someone praying and assume they're weak. You hear someone say they're hopeful and it makes you angry. Not because you're bad, but because something inside of you has stopped believing. This is the heart of Dostoevsky's warning. If you stop believing in meaning, suffering doesn't end, it metastasizes. It becomes chromic, cold, invisible. You don't cry anymore, you go numb. You don't explode, you withdraw. You don't rebel, you disconnect. In the brothers Karamazov, Ivan is brilliant, moral, and tormented. He says he wants justice, but really he wants permission to detach, to check out, to wash his hands of the unbearable mess of the world. I respectfully return my ticket. Ivan Karamazov. That line is a refusal. A refusal to participate in a world where innocent children suffer. But beneath the philosophy is something deeper, a spiritual burnout that has nowhere left to go. This suffering is everywhere. You laugh at serious things to avoid feeling them. You distract yourself every second you're alone. You say whatever when you really mean I'm terrified. You've replaced faith with cynicism, vulnerability with irony, and wonder with scrolling. This isn't freedom. It's emotional dissociation disguised as maturity. Dostoevsky saw this coming. He saw that when humans lose contact with God not just as theology, but as the source of absolute value, they don't become rational machines. They become haunted. Haunted by choices that no longer feel tethered to anything real. Haunted by the suspicion that nothing actually matters and that feeling in itself is intolerable. So what do? We build illusions. We pursue pleasure. We play the role of the informed, detached, sophisticated skeptic while suffering the quiet agony of being unable to commit to anything that lasts. Everything is permitted. Dostoevsky, via Ivan's logic in the brothers Karamazov, this line is not celebration. It's warning. When everything is permitted, nothing is sacred. When nothing is sacred, there is no reason to suffer for something. And when there's nothing to suffer for, your pain becomes purposeless. That's the root of nihilism. Not that life is hard, but that it feels void. There's a reason so many of Dostoevsky's characters are paralyzed, self-loathing, or violent. They are spiritual amputees. They've lost their connection to a higher purpose, and the result is not freedom, it's inner collapse. Stavrogin in Demons has wealth, intellect, charisma, and a dead soul. He seduces, manipulates, commits atrocities not out of desire, but out of boredom. He feels nothing, and that nothingness becomes monstrous. If you've ever felt bored in the middle of your own success, felt disgusted by people who believe in something, felt like nothing you do really matters because it's all going to end anyway, you're not alone. You're not broken. You're just swimming in a culture that has forgotten what meaning costs and how much we need it. So what does Dostoevsky offer? Not easy answers, but a path, not out of suffering, but through it, because the only way out of nihilism is not pleasure, not distraction, not intellect. It is the rediscovery of something you're willing to suffer for. And this, Dostoevsky believed, begins in Revolt. To live without hope is to cease to live. Dostoevsky hope, for him, wasn't optimism. It was rebellion. Rebellion against despair. Rebellion against numbness. Rebellion against the quiet death of becoming a man with no interior life. And in that rebellion, meaning is not found. It is forged. This is where Dostoevsky aligns, surprisingly, with Albert Camus. Both believed that when confronted with absurdity, the only dignified response is revolt. But for Dostoevsky, that revolt leads not to stoic defiance but to the possibility of love, humility, and grace. Even when you stop believing, there's a part of you that still longs for truth, longs for connection, longs for a reason to bleed that isn't just biological. And that longing is the soul's refusal to die. It's your revolt against nihilism. So stop apologizing for needing meaning. Stop pretending numbness is wisdom. Stop calling avoidance peace, because your suffering isn't a glitch in the system. It's the system trying to wake you up. And you only need to ask yourself, what am I willing to suffer for? That's where your soul begins to return. Section the 4th. The suffering that transforms there is one kind of suffering that Dostoevsky believed could save a person. Not the kind that numbs, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that awakens. This is the suffering that doesn't crush your soul, but burns away everything false. He lived it himself. At 28, Dostoevsky stood before a firing squad, sentenced to death for political dissent. Seconds before the execution, a messenger arrived with a reprieve. The sentence was commuted to years of hard labor in Siberia, but the man who walked into exile wasn't the same as the one who emerged. He wrote later in The House of the Dead, "Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled, and if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say you've wasted time." This was not literary flourish. This was survival. In prison, stripped of identity, stripped of illusion, Dostoevsky encountered the one thing he couldn't outthink himself. And in that confrontation, he didn't find pride or certainty. He found humility. He found God. He found the possibility of love again. This is redemptive suffering. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reconstructs. And it almost always begins in darkness, in collapse, in the moment you realize that no one is coming to rescue you, not from the outside, because the real rescue comes from within. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Dostoevsky, what he meant was simple. When the ego dies, the soul speaks. When comfort ends, clarity begins. When the false self falls, the real self rises. This isn't poetic, it's spiritual architecture. In the brothers Karamazov, Alyosha is not the strongest or smartest character. He's not proud, he's not ambitious, but he suffers with his eyes open. And in that pain, he finds a form of grace, but nothing else could teach. Not through theory, not through success, through endurance, with meaning. Dostoevsky never promised relief. He promised rebirth for those willing to stay in the fire long enough to let it burn away the lie. So if you're suffering now, not just aching but changing, don't run from it. Don't explain it away. Don't numb it. Use it. Let it tear through the mask. Let it destroy the roles. Let it clear the ground for something real to grow. Because this, Dostoevsky believed, is where the soul is forged, and once it is, nothing can unmake it.